Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Injustice 2 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a fighting game developed by NetherRealm Studios and published by Warner Bros. Interactive in May of this year for PS4 and Xbox One, and it later saw a release on PC in November. It was generally very well received on launch, although there was a bit of criticism directed towards certain elements of the game, which I'll get to more when I get to the story and the gameplay sections. But the general consensus is that the high-quality standards that NetherRealm Studios has put forth ever since MK9 is still on full display here. And of course, the game went on to win several awards for Best Fighting Game of the Year, although let's be honest here, the competition wasn't exactly stiff there. So let's go ahead and delve right into the game and find out whether or not it actually does hold up to those really high quality standards or if something else entirely happened. Well, before we get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation. This does run in the Unreal Engine, and what they've managed to achieve with it is definitely very impressive. The facial animations are excellent during cutscenes, although when you're actually going around and fighting, you're going to see lots of mouth movements that look more like puppets than actual people talking. Now, I get that it's a fighting game, and when you're in the middle of a fight, you're not really concerned about the lip sync, but it is something you do notice on occasion, and it's kind of weird. Especially when you consider that the rest of the animations, and even the facial animations during cutscenes, are so much higher quality than those. There's a whole lot of smaller details that make not only the characters pop out, but even the environments look fantastic. You'll see objects in the background shake around when you land a particularly powerful blow and knock somebody into a wall or something like that. You'll see various other environmental interactions that are independent of the ones that you trigger yourself, and those actually look quite nice. And then of course the scene transitions and the environmental interactions you trigger yourself all look excellent as well, although during the scene transitions you'll notice that the frame rate does seem to drop. This is because all of the cutscenes are pre-rendered at 30 frames per second for some utterly baffling reason, while the actual gameplay is all at 60 frames per second. So while the actual gameplay is all butter smooth, the actual cutscenes look surprisingly choppy. But they are well animated despite that, so it kind of makes up for it. And when you combine that with the pretty solid texture quality, the excellent modeling, and I've already mentioned the animations, you have visuals that look very good. But then you move over into sound design, and that's where things start to get a bit messier. Namely, you have things like some of the voice acting being fantastic, and other bits of it being not so great. Most of the time the characters are voiced rather well, and you do have the likes of Kevin Conroy being Batman in this, so they've done a good job of getting the casting right, but the actual lines themselves can be fairly messy. That's more of a problem with Injustice 2's writing department, which I'll get to more in a moment, but suffice to say, it does have a negative effect on the actual character interactions as well, when you have these various lines they're saying and you're going, wait, what? Or they'll say something that's kind of cringe-inducing and you just kind of facepalm at it. Although you could certainly make an argument that that's a problem with superhero comic book writing in general, so I'm not sure it's something we can really hold against the game too much. Moving beyond the voice acting, you have a soundtrack that's a lot of orchestral stuff that is designed to sound like a superhero movie, and it works extremely well for the game, but unfortunately is just not very memorable. And by that I mean, if you heard it outside of the confines of the game, you'd probably instantly recognize it as superhero music, but you may not necessarily make the immediate connection to Injustice 2. That's not to say that it's bad music, because it's certainly not bad music, but it is rather generic and that does hold it back a bit. Then of course there's the sound effects, which fit rather well for a fighting game as well as a superhero game, although there's nothing in there that really stands out as being great. It all just does its job and it does it well. So overall, they've done a very good job with the presentation. But here's the thing, what really matter are not the presentation, but rather story and gameplay. The story in this takes place in the same universe as the original Injustice Gods Among Us, which means that it's an alternate universe where Superman went crazy basically and created a tyrannical regime ruled by him. If you want more details on that, you'll have to consult the original Injustice, because they don't really talk about it much in this one. They just talk about the aftermath after Batman rose up and defeated Superman at the end of Injustice 1. But the game actually doesn't start there. It starts with a cutscene showing the destruction of Krypton and the one responsible for it, and it also sets up Supergirl's introduction to the series because Kara Zor-El is sent off to Earth, but is sent off course while Kal-El is sent straight to Earth. After that, it picks up with more recent events, and you get to see a bit of the section when the regime was actually getting started, where Batman and Robin were trying to go up against it, only Robin ended up defecting, and thus you end up basically with Batman on his own against everything else. Then it's back to the current time, where a group called the Society, led by Gorilla Grodd, is trying to establish their own order. And Batman and his cohorts have to find a way to stop them. And of course that gets involved with much bigger things beyond that, eventually involving Brainiac. And Brainiac is ultimately the main antagonist of the game. The thing is, I don't really want to go into too much of a discussion about the story here because frankly it's a jumbled mess. The amount of times where it just haphazardly slaps together a vague excuse for a fight to happen is frankly pretty ridiculous, and you'll have characters that are introduced at one point and never actually matter in the grand scheme of things. For example, Atrocitus shows up at one point for a single fight and then he's never in the game again. Ever. There is basically no point to his introduction whatsoever. Similarly, Dr. Fate and Swamp Thing barely have a role in the story, and frankly I'm kind of surprised they even brought him up in the campaign to begin with. But even beyond moments like that, they just pull things out of nowhere and expect you to just kind of roll with it, and none of it really works. The storyline just ends up being a confusing mess that sends you all over the place just for the sake of fighting a handful of characters in a certain location, because why not, I guess? Point is that a lot of the story is just horrendously contrived and frankly is just not very good. But let's face it, storyline was never really the main strong point of the Injustice universe because the storyline even in Injustice 1 was pretty ridiculous. Whenever you have an alternate universe storyline where universes are going to collide, it's going to be a mess no matter what you do. But even taking that into account, the storyline here is just frankly complete garbage. They do give you a choice of two endings, but it's pretty painfully obvious which one is going to be the so-called canon ending whenever Injustice 3 rolls around. Because there's really only one ending that even leaves things open for a sequel. So even with multiple endings and even branching paths throughout the game where you'll be playing as different characters and you'll have a choice between who you play as in a given chapter, ultimately it's still going to fall down to the gameplay to bring things up. And luckily that's where Injustice 2 shines. What you have here is basically a continuation of what we saw with Injustice Gods Among Us, but with some slight tweaks. The 4-button style of play returns from the original game where you have light, medium, and heavy attacks as well as a character power button. So for example with Superman that initiates a sort of rage ability where he becomes more powerful, whereas Batman will summon a swarm of batarangs or Supergirl will use her eye beams or something along those lines. Unlike with, say, Mortal Kombat, there is not a dedicated block button, instead you have to move backwards or down in order to block an attack, and you have a super meter that can be used either to unleash your super move, which is a very powerful attack that triggers its own cutscene, or you can use the super meter to enhance your special attacks and make them a bit more powerful or give them various special effects. For example, with a lot of the special moves, when you use the meter burn on them, then it will give them an additional bounce where it will send the enemy bouncing into the air so you can continue a combo on them. You can also burn the meter in order to perform a roll or jump escape where you will jump out of a combo and get away from the enemy so they can't just keep hitting you. Or if you've lost your first health bar, then you can trigger a clash, which will allow you to wager an amount of your meter versus the other player wagering an amount of their meter, and whoever wagers more of their meter is going to win the clash and gain a special bonus. So for example, the defender will gain additional health back, and the attacker will do additional damage to the opponent. Of course, you can wager as much of the meter as you want, so you can do all or nothing and anything in between, and that will allow you to either win a clash or at least prevent the enemy from getting the best bonus that they can get. Of course, you have to be careful with the amount of super meter you use because it's only generated by doing damage. Either you do damage to the enemy for a small amount of meter, or the enemy does damage to you for more of the meter, and you have to be very careful with managing that, otherwise you won't have the meter for when you absolutely need it. So sometimes it's smarter to just deliberately lose a clash in order to preserve your super meter and possibly even get the enemy to use all of their super meter, thinking, oh well, they have a full meter, then I better use all of my meter in order to get the full advantage. And of course the clash itself is just a resource you have to spend sparingly as well because you only get one of them per match. Beyond those mechanics, the scene transitions return, where you can knock an enemy through the stage and it will do a lot of damage and throw you into another stage, so that actually gets pretty interesting and keeps things rather dynamic. And of course there are various stage interactions that you can do. For example, you can knock an enemy into the background for a fair bit of damage that will knock them back and let you combo back into them, or you can pick up items in the stage and throw them at the opponent, or if you're certain characters, then you can spring off of an object to get a large jump across the screen. And much like in the original Injustice, all of this works very well. It's still a very solid fighting game system that is extremely enjoyable for fighting game fans. Now, I did notice a few issues with button registration, where I would press buttons in various combos and it wouldn't necessarily trigger the combo the way it's supposed to be triggered. Now, some of that is of course just me being terrible at fighting games, but other times I did notice where I was doing things exactly and it was still not registering properly, and I think it was because the game is just really picky with its input registration. It seems like the timings just have to be very, very precise in certain instances, otherwise it's just not going to do what you tell it to do. Obviously you can practice at the game to work around that problem, but it is very annoying when you're starting out and you're finding that your button registrations aren't working exactly as you think they are. Again, it could just be a matter of me being terrible at fighting games. In fact, it probably is, but it's just something I felt I should mention for the casual fighting game fans out there who may not necessarily know what's going on. This is a very precise fighting game when you get down to it. That's why it's in the professional circuit right now and is doing very well in the professional circuit. But you don't have to be a pro in order to enjoy Injustice 2. I mean, it is still solid as a casual fighting game, and there's plenty on offer here if you're not looking to get into a competitive circuit. In addition to the campaign, which will probably take you about 6 to 8 hours to complete, you also have the multiverse, which is basically the arcade mode for the game, where you have your basic battle simulator being the normal arcade mode, but then the other multiverse challenges are going to be timed events where they will actually swap out after the time limit has expired for new conditions. For example, as I'm recording this video, they have a series of events going on in the multiverse where you can play as the various characters from the Justice League movie in specific challenges in order to get specific gear that is looking kind of like what they have in the movies. The main point there is that they're all timed events that have their own special modifiers. They might give you handicaps, they might give you additional bonuses. Regardless, they are all special events that change over time. Of course, you do always have access to the battle simulator, which is your basic arcade mode, so you can always go into that and mess around with that if you want, because those multiverse challenges tend to be for higher level characters. This brings up the main problem I have with the game, which is also something that a lot of people praised. It's the gear system. You see, as you play the game, your characters will level up. Now, as they level up, you will not only get access to things like additional elements for your hero card, which is just some cosmetic stuff, but you'll also get access to additional abilities. You'll get access to new loadouts that allow you to have different gear loadouts for a different playstyle. And you'll get access to more and more powerful gear and be able to take on tougher and tougher enemies. The thing is that the gear is not only cosmetic, it actually does affect your character's stats, and it is locked behind level requirements. On top of that, there are different rarities of gear. You have the commons, you have the rares, and you have the epics. Obviously, the epics give you the most substantial stat bonuses, and they also give you additional augments that have special abilities. For example, if you equip different bits of gear of the same set, then you'll probably get a set bonus, which allows you to have even higher stat bonuses than you normally would just equipping one piece of that gear. In theory, this makes the game horrendously unbalanced, but luckily when you go online, you can completely turn off stat bonuses from the gear. When you do that, they'll still have the look of the gear, but none of the stat bonuses, so it'll be basically a vanilla character at level 1 in terms of raw stats, fighting another character at vanilla level 1 in terms of raw stats. This allows the online play to still be competitive, but when you're playing in the single player, you'll have a bit more variety with what you can actually do. That said, if you're going into the multiverse challenges, you're going to find that things become ridiculously difficult ridiculously quickly because they actually do affect the stats pretty significantly. For example, I have a clip here of me playing as Starfire playing against a level 20 bot as part of one of the multiverse events, and you can see right off the bat that that level 20 bot just absolutely destroys me. And it's not just because I'm terrible at the game, but you can easily see that every single hit that bot is doing a ridiculous amount of damage. And every single time I hit the bot in turn, it barely does anything to it. This is because a level 20 bot is only balanced against other level 20 characters with level 20 gear. So if I had a level 20 character going up against that character with level 20 gear, then that would pretty much even the odds. But I was roughly half of that level, and I was just getting completely destroyed, so it does have a serious balancing issue. But again, since they give you the ability to turn off those gear bonuses when you go online, it doesn't make the playing field just hilariously one-sided. That said, even just completely ignoring the balancing issues, I am not remotely a fan of how you actually get all that gear. The only way you can obtain new gear in this game is to either get it randomly dropped to you at level ups or through the various events, or to open mother boxes. Yep, even Injustice 2 has loot boxes, although thankfully you cannot buy them. The only things you can purchase with real money in this game are source crystals, which are the premium currency that you can then use to buy cosmetic items like skins or special premiere skins that will actually change how the character acts. This means that, for example, you can set up your Superman to have a Bizarro skin, and thus, instead of playing just as Superman, you're playing as Bizarro with his own voice lines and his own mannerisms. But again, those are only cosmetic, and you actually do earn source crystals by playing the game anyway. You had to complete events to do it, but you do get source crystals for completing events. So it's not like you can't just earn those source crystals in order to buy the premiere skins anyway, it just takes you longer. And as for the mother boxes, like I said, the only way you can get those is by simply playing the game normally. You have to earn them through gameplay, and the game pretty much throws them at you like candy anyway, so it never really becomes a huge problem, but it is still annoying that that's the only way you can get gear. So in summary, for that particular bit, it's good that they tried to put in a lot of customization options for the various characters throughout the game, but unfortunately the way they did it is just not a good way of handling it at all. Similarly, they didn't really handle the character roster all that well either. You do have a pretty respectable selection of characters to choose from. I mean, you got your kind of staples, Superman, Batman, Aquaman, all of them, but then you have a couple of inclusions that just kind of make you scratch your head a bit. For example, Captain Cold. Frankly, his premiere skin is a lot more interesting. It's Mr. Freeze. Why couldn't we have Mr. Freeze instead of Captain Cold? I mean, really, who the hell is Captain Cold? Obviously, I'm being a bit sarcastic there. I know who Captain Cold is, but he's not really a good fit when you're having him go up against the likes of, well, Supergirl and Superman and Harley Quinn and all these recognizable characters that you pretty much all know from the DC universe. So while I do appreciate NetherRealm's efforts in trying to bring a few lesser-known characters from the DC universe into the mix, the ones they picked were really not all that great. But then there are the DLC characters, some of whom are very recognizable and big fan favorites. For example, Starfire. But it's not even just her, there's Red Hood, there's Black Manta, and even Darkseid. Hell, as I'm recording this, they just put in the Atom, and they're going to be putting in the Enchantress later on. So I'm not entirely sure who picked the lineup for this particular Injustice game, but they probably should rethink their priorities on that. Also, from a writing standpoint, it seems like they really hate the Titans, and I have no idea why. But beyond those characters, there's also the guest characters, and they have quite a few of them for this particular game. Not only do they have the expected Mortal Kombat cameos, in this case it's Sub-Zero and Raiden, but they even expanded things beyond their own games, and they actually just put Hellboy into the game, which is pretty cool. But then there's the guest characters they have yet to put into the game, and I'm really excited that they put them into the game, because it's going to be friggin' hilarious. And that is the Turtles. You know, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael. And I don't know about you, but the idea of the Turtles beating the living crap out of Superman is just hilarious to me. But here's the thing, regardless of which DLC characters you might go, oh, well, they're really cool, I want to play them, they're DLC characters. You have to pay for them on top of the base game. And each of the individual fighter packs are $20 a piece, or you get the Ultimate Edition, which has everything bundled together, and it's about $80. I'm sorry, but $60 for effectively the starter edition and then $80 for the complete edition is frankly pretty ridiculous. Even though as a fighting game, this is still a good game, and even though it is still worth playing, especially if you're a fan of DC Comics, or if you're a fan of the previous Injustice game, or you're just a fighting game fan, it's still hard to recommend it at full price. Because what you have here is really not much more than an incremental change over the previous Injustice game. And when you consider that the character lineup for this game isn't as strong as the base game, and the DLC is effectively required to get the full experience, you have a game that ultimately falls into the 3.5 out of 5 category. Again, it's a solid game, it's worth playing, but definitely do not get this at full price. If you're a fan of the original Injustice, or you're a fan of DC Comics, or you're a fan of fighting games and you want a good DC comic fighting game, then Injustice 2 will definitely fit the bill. But as it stands, I'd say the price is just too high for what you're getting here, and you should just wait for it to go on sale for a pretty good discount before you even consider picking it up. Thanks for watching.